Devon Price. On the evening of August 24, 2024, a correctional officer at Pelican Bay State Prison was walking an inmate from the restricted housing unit back toward his cell. It was a routine escort, the kind of thing the officer had performed hundreds of times before. But somewhere between the exit door and the cell, the inmate slipped one of his hands out of his handcuffs, turned, and drove an inmate-manufactured blade into the side of the officer's head. Within hours, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation had opened the investigation as attempted homicide. The man in the cuffs was Devon Price, then 33 years old, originally from the city of Ceres in Stanislaus County, California. Long before Pelican Bay, before the restricted housing, before the improvised weapons and the escalating attacks, Price had already taken a life for reasons that never quite fit together on paper. His original victim was a man named Phelane Jones. Jones was 37 years old, a single father, and by every account not the man Price actually wanted that night. He was not involved in gangs. He was not involved in crime. He was a working father whose young daughter would eventually be named after him. On April the 23rd, 2016, Jones was outside the Villa's Parkside Apartments on West Hawkeye Avenue in Turlock, California, when a black car pulled up alongside him. Someone inside the vehicle opened fire. Jones was shot 4 times, in the face, in the neck, and in the chest, and he died at the scene. According to Deputy District Attorney Jeff Manger, Price had mistaken Jones for someone else entirely. That was the reason a young girl grew up without her father. Price was convicted in August of 2017 of second-degree murder, along with a firearm by felon count and a set of enhancements attached to it. Because he already had a prior strike on his record, the court sentenced him as a second striker to 60 years to life in state prison. His co-defendant, Kevin Jerome Barnes, Jr., was convicted as an accessory and received 6 years. Price was received into the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation on November 7, 2017. He was still in his mid-20s. For most inmates, a sentence like that is the end of the story. For Devon Price, it turned out to be the starting point of a longer and worse record. The first documented incident inside the system came in July of 2022, when Price was sentenced in Del Norte County to an additional 4 years and 4 months for a battery on a non-prisoner and for resisting or deterring an officer with threats or violence. A little over a year later, in September of 2023, a Marin County court added another 4 years for possession or manufacture of a weapon inside prison. That was the pattern that would define him. Every time officers thought they had accounted for him, another weapon would surface, and another sentence would attach to the one he was already never going to finish. By the summer of 2024, Price was being housed in the restricted housing unit at Pelican Bay, one of the most controlled environments in the entire California prison system. The kind of housing that exists specifically to keep men like him separated from the people they would otherwise hurt. It was inside that unit, on the evening of August 24th, that everything the record had been warning about finally came due. It was approximately 6:35 in the evening. A correctional officer was escorting Price back to his cell, cuffs on, hands secured behind the back, standard procedure. At some point during that walk, Price worked one of his hands free from the cuff. He turned and struck the officer in the face. Then he continued to strike him, in the head and in the torso, with an inmate-manufactured weapon. The officer was stabbed in the head. Investigators later found 2 separate puncture wounds in his stab-resistant vest, injuries that would have gone much deeper if not for the equipment he was wearing. Other staff responded almost immediately and used force to end the attack. The officer was transported for medical treatment and released the same evening. The vest and the speed of the response were the reasons he lived. What do you do with a man who is already serving 60 years to life, who has been sanctioned twice for prison violence, and who was still able to manufacture and conceal a weapon inside one of the most restrictive housing units in the state? The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation opened the case as an attempted homicide and referred it to the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. The referral moved forward through the local court system, but the final disposition of the 2024 case has not been publicly confirmed in the reporting available at the time of this recording. Price was left in restricted housing pending that outcome. As of the making of this video, Devonai Damarea Price remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He is still serving the 60-year-to-life sentence from the 2017 murder conviction, on top of the additional prison violence terms that were stacked on afterward. He is not eligible for release for decades, and if the attempted homicide referral out of Del Norte County results in another conviction, that horizon will push out further still. Price's story is one of a man whose violence began outside the walls of Pelican Bay and only escalated once he was inside them. The next inmate on this list arrived at Pelican Bay by a different road. His conviction was tied to gang activity in the South Bay. His time in state custody was measured in months, not years, before it turned deadly. And what he did inside a housing unit day room on a Friday evening in the summer of 2022 would become part of what may have been the worst single week the California prison system had seen in years. Fernando Torres Lopez. In the last week of July 2022, the California state prison system went through a stretch of days that even the most experienced administrators would remember. 3 separate inmates in 3 separate prisons were killed by other inmates within the span of 7 days. The third and final killing happened at Pelican Bay State Prison, inside the day room of a housing unit, on the evening of July 29th. But the man who did it did not fit the profile most people would expect from that kind of institution. He was 23 years old, and he had been in the state prison system for less than a year. Fernando Torres Lopez was originally from Santa Clara County in Northern California. He was only 22 years old when the state sentenced him, in August of 2021, to 19 years and 8 months in prison. The convictions on his record read like the resume of a young man who had been rehearsing for something worse. Attempted second-degree murder, carrying a firearm in public with a prior felony, 2 separate counts of assault with a deadly weapon, both committed in the commission of a street gang act. He was received into state custody in the fall of 2021 and eventually placed at Pelican Bay, the flagship maximum security facility on California's remote north coast. He was not there long. The victim's name was Uriel Otero. Otero was also only 22 years old, and he was also from a county just south of the Bay Area, in his case, Monterey. Otero was no stranger to the same world that had produced his attacker. In July of 2021, 1 month before Torres Lopez received his own sentence, Otero had been sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted second-degree murder with a firearm and for causing great bodily injury in the commission of a street gang act. Both men were from the Greater Bay Area. Both had been sentenced within weeks of each other for gang-related shootings. Both had been sent into the same maximum security prison system, and both had ended up housed in the same section of the same facility. It happened on July the 29th, 2022, sometime around 5:30 in the afternoon. In the day room of a housing unit at Pelican Bay, An altercation broke out between Torres Lopez and Otero. Staff intervened, and Otero was rushed for emergency medical care. At 6:20 in the evening, less than an hour after the altercation began, he was pronounced dead. Torres Lopez was moved into segregated housing, while the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Investigative Services Unit and the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office began working the case as a homicide. It was the third inmate-on-inmate homicide in the California State Prison system in 7 days. In separate incidents at 2 other institutions across the state, prisoners had already been killed in the days leading up to Otero's death. Whether the 3 killings were connected by common gang politics or simply by coincidence has never been fully answered in the reporting on those incidents. But for correctional administrators, the pattern was hard to ignore. To understand how those young men ended up close enough to each other for one of them to take the other's life, it helps to understand what Pelican Bay had recently become. The facility had spent most of its history built around the idea of isolating the most dangerous gang leaders and validated gang members in its security housing unit, a set of 8 cell pods where prisoners spent roughly 22.5 hours a day locked down alone. In 2015, that system was significantly changed by the settlement of a long federal lawsuit that ended the practice of indefinite gang validation solitary confinement. Prisoners who had been held in the security housing unit for a decade or more, and in some cases longer than 20 years, were moved back into general population. Rival factions who had been separated by concrete walls for most of their adult lives were suddenly sharing day rooms, dining halls, and yards. Correctional officers, prison researchers, and inmates themselves had been warning for years that this change would produce a spike in inmate-on-inmate violence in the yards and common areas of California's high-security prisons. The killing of Uriel Otero was one of many incidents during that period that seemed to confirm the warning. How does a state that spent decades building an entire facility around the goal of separating its most dangerous inmates end up in a situation where 2 young men, both serving long gang-related sentences, are placed close enough to each other for one to take the other's life inside a housing unit day room? The homicide investigation into Torres Lopez was referred to the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office. Reporting available at the time of this recording confirms that the case was under investigation and that Torres Lopez had been placed in segregated housing, but the final disposition of any additional charges has not been publicly documented. If the referral results in a conviction, it will be stacked on top of the sentence he is already serving. As of the making of this video, Fernando Torres Lopez remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He is still serving the 19-year and 8-month sentence out of Santa Clara County, and any prison homicide conviction stacked on top of that sentence would extend his release date well beyond the original horizon. Uriel Otero, 22 years old at the time of his death, is buried in his home county of Monterey. His original 25-year sentence, in the end, lasted just over a year. Otero's killing was one incident in one day room on one afternoon. Less than 2 years later, another young man from Southern California would be at the center of a strikingly similar scene at Pelican Bay. Another day room, another altercation, another inmate-manufactured weapon, and another body pronounced dead less than an hour after the fight began. But the third case on this list would come with a complication that made assigning blame considerably more difficult than in the first 2. Joseph Quintero. In April of 2024, 4 inmates were placed into restricted housing at Pelican Bay after another prisoner turned up dead inside a housing unit day room. Only one of them was documented as being in a direct physical altercation with the man who died. The inmate manufactured weapon believed to have been used in the killing was recovered near a cell occupied by two of the others, and more than a year later, exactly which of the four is responsible for what remains a question that state investigators were still working to answer. The one caught in the physical altercation was Joseph A. Quintero, then 36 years old, received into state custody from Los Angeles County on December 2, 2021. Quintero was serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for a first-degree murder conviction as a second striker. In September of 2023, roughly 7 months before the Pelican Bay incident, a court had added another 2 years to his sentence for possession of a controlled substance inside prison. Before continuing, one point of clarification is worth making. There is a separate man named Jose Prisciliano Quintero who was convicted of an unrelated murder in Phoenix, Arizona in 2008. That is a different individual entirely. The Joseph Quintero involved in the 2024 Pelican Bay incident is not that man, and every detail in this segment refers only to the California case. The victim was Michael R. Chalonnet, 36 years old, from Ventura County. Chalonnet had been received into state custody in his own right and was serving 21 years for voluntary manslaughter with a gang enhancement, along with a set of additional in-prison offenses that had extended his time behind the walls. Two men, both in their mid-30s, both with long sentences already attached to them, both housed in the same section of the same California prison. It happened on April 21, 2024, at approximately 6:55 in the evening. During dayroom activities in a housing unit, Quintero and Chalonnet became involved in a physical altercation. Staff intervened, and Chalonnet was found to have sustained multiple puncture wounds. He was rushed for medical treatment. At 7:47 in the evening, less than an hour after the fight began, Michael Chalonnet was pronounced dead. When investigators secured the scene and reviewed the movements of the inmates present, 4 men were identified as persons of interest and placed into restricted housing. Along with Quintero, they moved a man named Michael Jones, a man named Oscar Monsibais, and a man named Omar Arzate into segregated cells while the investigation continued. The physical evidence complicated the picture. An inmate-manufactured weapon believed to be tied to the killing was recovered near a cell occupied by Monsibais and Arzate, not by Quintero. Quintero was the one who had been in the direct altercation with Chalonnet. The weapon was found in the vicinity of 2 others. Whether the killing was the act of one man carried out with a weapon he had passed off, the act of multiple men working together, or something more complicated than either, was not answered in the initial reporting. A motive for the attack was not disclosed. This kind of ambiguity is not unusual in prison homicide investigations. Inside a high-security housing unit, correctional officers have a limited number of vantage points. Security cameras have their own blind spots, and the inmates present at the scene are almost never willing to sit down for a formal statement with investigators. What that leaves prosecutors with is physical evidence, movement records, and the account of the officers who arrived first. In the case of Michael Chalonnet's death, those 3 sources did not converge on a single actor. They pointed at a group. At what point does a homicide investigation stop being about a single act and start being about a coordinated one? And how do you build a prosecutable case against 4 men when the physical evidence, the direct contact, and the recovered weapon are all pointing in slightly different directions? The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation opened the case as a homicide and worked it with the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office. Reporting available at the time of this recording confirms that the 4 men were placed in restricted housing and that the investigation was ongoing, but the final disposition of charges against any of them has not been publicly documented. That leaves the case at a specific and uncomfortable stage. One inmate was dead. 4 others had been identified as potentially responsible. The process of separating one from the others was still working its way through the California correctional and court system. The dining hall and day room cases that have become part of Pelican Bay's recent history often share this same profile. Multiple inmates present at the scene, an inmate-manufactured weapon recovered at some distance from the actual altercation, and an investigation that unfolds over months rather than days as prosecutors work to determine who did what. It is one of the reasons that the public disposition of these cases lags so far behind the incident itself. As of the making of this video, Joseph A. Quintero remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, still serving the life with possibility of parole sentence from Los Angeles County, along with the additional 2-year drug term from 2023. Michael Chalonnet, 36 years old at the time of his death, was serving a 21-year sentence out of Ventura County that had already been extended by additional in-prison offenses. Whatever the final legal outcome for the 4 men in restricted housing, Chalonnet's 21-year term ended in a day room in Del Norte County in the spring of 2024. The first 3 inmates in this segment came into Pelican Bay in the same rough era. Their sentences began within the last decade. Their acts of violence inside the prison were spontaneous or opportunistic, and the ledger of what they did was still being written in the courts of Del Norte County. The next name is a different kind of case entirely. He did not stumble into Pelican Bay. He did not become notorious inside its walls. He arrived already carrying one of the most feared reputations in the California prison system, and he spent decades inside the security housing unit, running one of the most powerful criminal organizations the state has ever produced. Rene "Boxer" Enriquez. Rene Enriquez was raised in a middle-class household in Cerritos, California, and by every standard measure of that neighborhood, he had every reason to grow up quietly. He did not. Somewhere around the age of 12 or 13, he jumped into a local street gang called Artesia 13. His older brother Mark gave him the nickname that would eventually become known to every gang investigator in California: Boxer. By his late teens, he was already accumulating armed robbery convictions and cycling through the California juvenile and adult correctional systems. He was born on July 7, 1962. By the time he was 19, he was inside the Dual Vocational Institution, a state facility that at the time served as a training ground for young offenders and, more consequentially, a recruiting ground for the Mexican mafia. La M, as the organization is known, had by then established itself as the dominant Hispanic prison gang in California. Enriquez was noticed. He was used as a hitman inside the walls, and in 1985 he was made a full member of the organization, a colonel, and eventually rose to a position of significant leadership. His documented acts inside the prison system began early. He stabbed a fellow gang member who survived. He reportedly killed an imprisoned member of the Vagos Motorcycle Club, known to other inmates as Chainsaw. In 1989, when he was briefly paroled after roughly a decade behind bars, Boxer Enriquez was on the outside for a matter of weeks before the killings began again. The first was a woman named Cynthia Gavaldon. She was 28 years old and suspected by the Mexican mafia of being a drug dealer who was withholding what the organization called street tax, the percentage of a dealer's revenue that goes upward to the gang. Enriquez ordered her killed. Her body was found in a vacant lot in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. The second was a fellow-made member of the Mexican mafia, David Gallegos, 47 years old. According to reporting on the case, Enriquez personally administered a heroin overdose to Gallegos and then shot him 5 times in the head. In July of 1991, While awaiting trial for those killings, Enriquez and another man attacked a rival Mexican mafia leader named Salvador Buenrostro, known as Mon, inside a Los Angeles County jail visiting an interview room. Buenrostro was stabbed roughly 26 times. He survived. Enriquez was returned to the state prison system on those cases. In the years that followed, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, along with assault charges and a drug trafficking conspiracy, and was sentenced to 20 years to life. He was received back into California state custody in 1993, this time validated as a full Mexican mafia member, and eventually placed in the Security Housing Unit at Pelican Bay. The Security Housing Unit at Pelican Bay had been designed specifically to break the operational capacity of men like Enriquez. Prisoners were held in 8 by 10-foot concrete cells, alone, for roughly 22.5 hours a day. Contact with the outside world was tightly controlled. And yet, for decades, the Mexican mafia continued to run drug operations, extortion schemes, and killings on the streets of Southern California through coded letters, legal mail, and messages passed by fellow inmates. Many of them coordinated from inside Pelican Bay itself. Somewhere in the early 2000s, the calculation changed. According to Enriquez, he had come to believe that the Mexican mafia had begun killing the children and innocent relatives of members who had fallen out of favor, and that the organization he had joined was no longer the one he had signed up for. He defected. Beginning in 2002 and 2003, he became a federal cooperating witness. By 2006, he was wearing a wire to expose a murder-for-hire scheme. He provided expert testimony in dozens of state and federal cases. He was credited with helping the Federal Bureau of Investigation dismantle major elements of the Mexican mafia in a 2013 roundup. His life inside the walls became the subject of a book by the journalist Chris Blatchford titled The Black Hand. What happens to a man like that when the state that once needed him locked away for the rest of his life decides he might be more useful walking out the front door? The California Parole Board recommended Enriquez for release multiple times. His release was blocked 5 separate times at the gubernatorial level, 3 times by Governor Jerry Brown in 2015, 2016, and 2017, and twice by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019 and 2020. In August of 2021, a Los Angeles County Superior Court judge overturned the 2020 reversal. On July 18, 2022, the parole board again approved his release, and this time Governor Newsom declined to personally intervene, citing what his office described as unique procedural and appellate history, along with other unusually complex factors. As of the making of this video, Renee Boxer Enriquez is out of the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and is living under the protection of the United States Marshals Service. In December of 2024 and January of 2025, he sat for filmed interviews with the interviewer known online as Soft White Underbelly, on camera, face shown, confirming that he is free. His exact release date from CDCR has not been documented in a single reliable public source, and his current whereabouts, by the nature of witness protection, are inherently confidential. The now adult children of Cynthia Gavaldan, the woman Enriquez ordered killed in 1989, have publicly objected to the treatment he received as a law enforcement asset, and have said they fear gang retaliation for their family in the years since his release. If you're enjoying this video and you're not subscribed yet, take a second to hit that button. It really helps this channel grow. Nathaniel Dorswit. On the afternoon of March 23, 2023, 2 inmates walked out onto a yard at Pelican Bay State Prison and attacked a third man who was already there. The attack was fast. One inmate-manufactured weapon was recovered from the scene. The man they attacked was 53 years old and had been serving a life sentence for a homicide he had committed a decade earlier in San Diego. Within about an hour and 40 minutes, he was pronounced dead. He never made it back inside the housing unit. The younger of the two attackers was Nathaniel Dorswit, 26 years old at the time, originally received into California state custody from San Bernardino County on November 9, 2021. Dorswit was serving 15 years for first-degree burglary and attempted second-degree murder, a second-strike offense that had followed him from Southern California all the way up to the north coast of the state. His co-attacker was a man named Derek Lance. Lance was 48 years old at the time of the incident and was serving a life sentence out of Orange County for attempted first-degree murder, a case that had originated in 2016. Neither man was a stranger to the California prison system. Both had spent years inside its walls, and both were housed in the same section of the same yard on the day the attack took place. The man they attacked was Joseph Hill. Hill was 53 years old and had been received into state custody from San Diego County on November 23, 2015. He was serving a life sentence measured in the hundreds of years for a killing he had committed on December 29, 2013. His victim in that original case was a man named Sean O'Toole, 47 years old, killed in the Linda Vista neighborhood of San Diego. The motive, according to reporting on the case, was that Hill had felt O'Toole had disrespected his girlfriend. Hill was arrested, tried, and eventually convicted of first-degree murder for the killing. The attack on Hill happened on March 23, 2023, at approximately 2:10 in the afternoon. Dorswit and Lance went after him on the yard. Staff intervened. One inmate-manufactured weapon was recovered from the scene. Hill was rushed for medical treatment. At 3:51 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 41 minutes after the attack began, Joseph Hill was pronounced dead. Both Dorswit and Lance were placed in segregated housing, while the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Investigative Services Unit and the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office began working the case as a homicide. The motive for the attack was not disclosed in the initial public reporting. Whether Dorswit and Lance knew Hill personally, whether the attack was ordered by another party inside the prison, or whether the fight was strictly a matter of yard politics between the three men was not made public. A yard attack of this kind presents particular difficulty for investigators. Unlike an incident inside a cell, the yard has more available witnesses. But those witnesses, the other inmates who were on the yard at the same time, are usually the least willing to sit down with prosecutors. That leaves the case to be built on physical evidence, on the recovered weapon, on any camera coverage of the yard, and on the accounts of the officers who arrived on the scene. How does a man who has just been convicted of first-degree burglary and attempted murder, a man who by every reasonable measure of a 15-year sentence is supposed to be serving out his time and going home in the middle of his life, end up co-attacking a fellow prisoner within 18 months of arriving at Pelican Bay? The homicide investigation was referred to the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office, as is the pattern with most of the recent Pelican Bay killings. The initial reporting confirms that both attackers were moved into restricted housing and that the case was under investigation. But the final disposition of any additional charges has not been publicly documented at the time of this recording. As of the making of this video, Nathaniel Dorswit remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, still serving the original 15-year sentence out of San Bernardino County. Derek Lance remains in custody as well, still serving the life sentence out of Orange County. Joseph Hill, whose original life sentence for the killing of Sean O'Toole in 2013 was measured in centuries, ended his time behind the walls on a yard in Del Norte County in the spring of 2023. Dorswit and Lance went after an inmate. The next case on this list, less than 2 years later, would involve a coordinated attack of a very different kind. 3 prisoners, 1 target, and the target was not another inmate. It was the correctional officer in charge of them. It happened in a dining hall on a winter morning, in front of other staff, and it left the officer hospitalized in the intensive care unit. The 3 men who did it were transferred to another institution before the day was over. Jose Gonzalez. On the morning of January 30th, 2025, at approximately 7:15, a supervising correctional officer at Pelican Bay was in the dining hall of one of the facility's housing units when 3 inmates walked toward him at the same time. What happened next was described by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation as an attempted homicide. The officer was stabbed. He was rushed to a hospital and admitted for observation, with reports later identifying him and confirming he had been treated in the intensive care unit. The senior of the 3 men was Jose M. Gonzalez, 38 years old, originally from Los Angeles County. Gonzalez had been received into state custody on June 25, 2008, and had been in the California prison system for the better part of 17 years by the time of the dining hall attack. He was serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for a first-degree murder conviction. Attached to that murder conviction were 2 additional counts. He had been convicted of evading a peace officer while driving recklessly, and of intentional discharge of a firearm causing great bodily injury or death. The convictions on his sheet were tied to a car chase, a firearm, and a killing. The second man was Luis Torres, 34 years old, also from Los Angeles County, received into state custody on February 7, 2014. Torres was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder, along with an intentional firearm discharge count. During his time in prison, he had already accumulated an additional 4-year sentence for an in-prison assault, a term that had been stacked on top of the life sentence he was already carrying. Between him and Gonzalez, the dining hall that morning contained 2 men with life sentences for separate first-degree murders out of the same county. The third man was Richard Wilson, 32 years old, originally from Sacramento County, received into state custody on January 17, 2015. Wilson's original sentence was structured a little differently from the other 2. He had been sentenced to 14 years for driving under the influence causing injury, enhanced by a prior serious felony. But like Torres, Wilson had used his time inside the prison system to add years to his sentence rather than to reduce it. In 2018, a San Luis Obispo County court had added time for a battery on a non-prisoner. In 2021, a Del Norte County court had added time for weapon manufacture inside prison. That last one is worth noting because a Del Norte County weapon manufacture conviction meant Wilson had already been caught with a homemade weapon at Pelican Bay years before the dining hall incident. It happened on January 30th, 2025, at approximately 7:15 in the morning. Gonzalez, Torres, and Wilson attacked the supervising correctional officer with an inmate-manufactured weapon in the dining hall. According to a fundraiser later organized by supporters of the officer, his name was Anthony Rivera. Rivera sustained a laceration and multiple puncture wounds. He was transported to a hospital, admitted, and treated in the intensive care unit. Other staff responded to the attack and used oleoresin capsicum pepper spray to force the 3 men to break off. Once the officer was moved out for medical treatment, Gonzalez, Torres, and Wilson were placed in restricted housing. All three men were transferred out of Pelican Bay to another California institution before the end of the day, a routine move for attackers whose target was a staff member of the facility they had been attacked at. What does it take for three inmates, all with long California sentences, one of them a first-degree murderer with 17 years already in the system, to walk into the dining hall of a maximum security prison at 7:15 in the morning and jointly attempt to kill the officer in charge? The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation opened the case as an attempted homicide and referred it to the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office for prosecution. Because the target was a peace officer performing his duties, the charging exposure carried by all three men in Del Norte County is substantial. As of the making of this video, the final disposition of the case has not been publicly documented, but the three attackers remain in restricted housing at a separate California institution while the investigation and prosecution move forward. Officer Anthony Rivera, according to the public fundraiser organized on his behalf, was in serious enough condition that he was admitted to the intensive care unit. The exact status of his recovery has not been documented in the reporting available at the time of this recording. Jose M. Gonzalez, Luis Torres, and Richard Wilson remain in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, now spread across different institutions from the facility where the attack took place. The Gonzalez, Torres, and Wilson case is a clear example of what a coordinated attack inside a California prison looks like. Three men attacked one target with a single inmate-manufactured weapon, and they did it in front of other staff. The next case on this list is the opposite of that. It happened in a cell, out of sight, and it was hours before staff realized what had happened. The suspect was in the recreation yard when the body was found. Jesse A. Rippey. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon on October 17, 2020, staff at Pelican Bay conducted a routine check of a two-man cell in one of the housing units and found one of the men lying unresponsive. He was pronounced dead 35 minutes later. His cellmate was on the recreation yard when the check took place. When investigators located the cellmate to interview him, they noticed his face was swollen. There were scratches and bruises on his body. The cellmate was a man named Jesse A. Rippey. Rippey had been received at Pelican Bay on September 24, 2015, on a 10-year sentence for first-degree burglary. That was the sentence he had brought in with him. 2 years into that term, in 2017, a California court added another 15 years to his sentence for assault by a prisoner with a deadly weapon or with force likely to cause great bodily injury. That 2017 conviction is worth noting because it meant that by the fall of 2020, when his cellmate was found dead, Rippey already had a formally documented history of using force capable of great bodily injury against other prisoners. The man in the cell was Joshua E. Kirtley. Kirtley was 42 years old at the time of his death and had been received at Pelican Bay on July 28, 2004. He was serving a life sentence for a homicide committed years earlier in southern Humboldt County. That original case dated back to 1998. Kirtley had killed a man named Paul Sanders at a marijuana grow site in southern Humboldt, reportedly over a missing $5,000. Sanders's body was not recovered until June of 2003, roughly 5 years after the killing. Kirtley was eventually convicted and sent to Pelican Bay. His life sentence had, by the fall of 2020, already stretched more than 16 years since his arrival at the facility, and roughly 22 years since the original killing. On October 17, 2020, at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, staff conducting a check on the cell shared by Rippey and Kirtley found Kirtley unresponsive. He was rushed for medical treatment. At 1:05 in the afternoon, Joshua Kirtley was pronounced dead. Rippey was not in the cell at the time of the discovery. He had been sent out to the recreation yard earlier and was still there. When investigators located him and interviewed him, they noted a set of physical injuries on his own body. He had facial swelling, scratches, and bruises. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation moved him into segregated housing while the case was worked as a homicide. The initial reporting available at the time of the incident noted that the cause of Kirtley's death was still under investigation and that no formal charges against Rippey had been announced. What happens to a homicide case in which a man is found dead in his cell? The only other person who shared that cell has documented injuries consistent with a physical fight, and the physical space of the incident is a locked two-man room inside one of the most closely observed housing units in the California prison system. The pattern for a case like this is a slow one. Physical evidence has to be catalogued. A cause of death has to be officially determined by a coroner or medical examiner. Interviews have to be conducted with any inmate housed nearby, and the case has to be referred to the Del Norte County District Attorney's Office for a charging decision. The reporting available at the time of this recording does not include a publicly documented disposition of the case. The investigation was open when the incident was announced by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and later coverage does not confirm the filing or resolution of homicide charges against Rippey. That is not an unusual outcome for a case of this type. Prison homicides in remote counties, involving inmates who are already serving long sentences, often move through the court system on a timeline measured in years rather than months. As of the making of this video, Jesse A. Rippey remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He continues to serve the combined 25-year sentence made up of the 2015 10-year burglary term and the 2017 15-year in-prison assault term. Joshua E. Kirtley, whose original life sentence for the 1998 killing of Paul Sanders had stretched more than 2 decades by the time of his death, was pronounced dead in his cell at Pelican Bay in the early afternoon of October 17, 2020. Rippey's case is the story of a 2-man cell and a killing that happened out of sight. The final name on this list is the story of the opposite extreme. A 1-man cell inside the security housing unit, closely monitored, formally recognized by prison officials as one of the most watched cells in the entire California system. And the man inside it has been described in reputable national reporting as the single most dangerous prisoner in California. Paul "Corn-Fed" Schneider. For decades, correctional officers who worked the security housing unit at Pelican Bay understood that one of the cells in that unit was different from the others. It was formally identified by prison officials as the operational headquarters of the Aryan Brotherhood inside California. The man in it was a career armored car robber who had joined the gang inside prison by stabbing a rookie correctional officer in the throat. He was serving 3 separate life sentences, and one veteran guard who first encountered him in the 1980s later described him to a national magazine as the most dangerous man in the state. His name was Paul John Schneider. Schneider was born in 1962 and grew up in Cerritos, California, the same middle-class Southern California town that had produced Rene Enriquez a few years earlier. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed roughly 226 pounds. His nickname inside the prison system was Corn-Fed. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already begun a career as an armored car robber. He and his associates robbed 4 separate armored cars before he was finally caught. His original sentence, handed down in 1985, was 17 years. Reporting on his case has also linked him, in a role that has never been fully clarified, to a much larger armored car heist of approximately $3.4 million associated with the neo-Nazi organization known as the Order. Around 1987, while housed at Folsom Prison, Schneider took the step that would define the next several decades of his life. To be admitted into the Aryan Brotherhood, he stabbed a rookie correctional officer named Karl Kropp in the neck and throat during a strip search. Kropp survived. Schneider was rewarded with membership in the Aryan Brotherhood, and the California court system responded with a life sentence. He was moved out of Folsom Prison and eventually to Pelican Bay, into the security housing unit that had been designed specifically to isolate men like him from the general population and from each other. In March of 1990, Schneider was brought from prison to a Sacramento County courthouse to testify in an unrelated case. He had prepared for the trip. During the transport, he had concealed a 9-inch shiv fashioned from a stainless steel soup ladle inside his rectum. When he was seated in the courthouse, he produced the shiv and attacked a defense attorney named Philip Cozens, stabbing him 4 times before he was restrained. Cozens survived. Schneider later wrote that his original target had been the prosecutor. He had ended up stabbing the defense attorney only because of where the 2 men had been positioned in the courtroom when he produced the weapon. At his 1991 trial for that attack, Schneider pleaded guilty in exchange for a specific set of terms he had negotiated himself: 2 pepperoni pizzas and 2 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. He received his second life sentence. By the early 1990s, Schneider was locked inside the Pelican Bay security housing unit for roughly 22.5 hours a day, in an 11 by 7.5-foot cell. Prison officials formally identified that cell as the headquarters of the Aryan Brotherhood within the California prison system. From inside that cell, according to state and federal investigators, Schneider ordered killings both inside and outside of the walls. Keith Whitley, a former correctional officer who had first encountered Schneider in 1987 at Folsom, later told the national magazine Rolling Stone that he considered Schneider to be the most dangerous man in California. The description came from a man who had spent years working around him. While inside the security housing unit, Schneider and his cellmate at the time, a man named Dale Breches, began running a business breeding Presa Canario dogs. The venture was called Dog O' War. According to reporting by the Southern Poverty Law Center, prison officials believed the animals were being bred for sale to the guards of clandestine methamphetamine laboratories operating in rural areas. 2 of the dogs, named Bane and Hera, were kept on the outside by a pair of San Francisco attorneys named Marjorie Knoller and Robert Knoll. Knoller and Knoll had taken on Schneider as a legal client, and in an arrangement that later drew significant public attention, they legally adopted the 38-year-old Schneider as their son. On January 26, 2001, the 2 dogs attacked and killed a woman named Diane Alexis Whipple in the hallway of the San Francisco apartment building where she and Knoller both lived. Whipple was 33 years old. She had been a 2-time All-American lacrosse player, first in high school and then at Pennsylvania State University, and was at the time of her death the lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College of California. She lived with her partner, Sharon Smith. The California Supreme Court's opinion in the case that followed described Whipple's injuries as extensive. Knoller was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder. Both Knoller and Knoll were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Their adoption of Schneider had been completed only days after Whipple's death. Schneider himself was not present at the attack, was not on trial for it, and could not be, given that he was in the Pelican Bay security housing unit at the time. But his role as the breeder of the 2 animals became one of the defining details of the entire case. How does a man locked in a 1-man cell for 22.5 hours a day, in what was at the time the most restrictive housing unit in California, end up as the central figure in a nationally covered dog-mauling death in San Francisco, a federal racketeering case tied to the killing of a sheriff's deputy, and 3 separate life sentences? On September 4, 2003, Schneider entered a guilty plea in a federal racketeering case built against the leadership of the Aryan Brotherhood. He pleaded guilty to running a prison drug smuggling operation and to ordering a robbery in which a Sonoma County Sheriff's deputy was killed. That deputy was Frank V. Trejo. Trejo was 58 years old. He was shot and killed with a sawed-off shotgun on March 29, 1995, near Sebastopol, California. During the course of the robbery Schneider had ordered, the actual triggerman was a man named Robert Walter Scully. Scully had been paroled out of Pelican Bay only days before the killing. The driver of the getaway vehicle was Brenda Moore, who at the time was Schneider's girlfriend. Scully was later sentenced to death for Trejo's killing, and the California Supreme Court upheld his death sentence in 2021. On October 28, 2003, Schneider was sentenced in the federal case to a 3rd life term, this one for his role in ordering the robbery. As of the making of this video, Paul John Schneider is presumed to still be in custody, serving 3 separate life sentences. His exact current facility and confirmation of his living or deceased status have not been verified through a single reliable public source at the time of this recording. Some reporting has noted that he formally renounced his Aryan Brotherhood membership at a later point, and that he provided testimony in a federal lawsuit brought by a fellow long-term Pelican Bay inmate named Todd Ashker. Frank Trejo, the Sonoma County Sheriff's deputy killed in the robbery Schneider had ordered from inside a maximum security prison cell, was 58 years old at the time of his death. Those are 8 of the inmates whose time inside Pelican Bay left a lasting mark on the officers who worked around them. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.